With us in the studio is financial journalist and economist Daniel Ben-Ami with the report on global inequality, and to discuss his report, volunteer Joe Vandervoort.
Thanks, Ruji. Equality is always to be welcomed when it means more for the mass of the population. More cars, more mobile phones, more roads, more hospitals, more power stations and so on. Increases in living standards should be celebrated. But there's another kind of demand for equality which should be rejected. I call it Caveman Equality. Think about it. In the Stone Age, people were pretty equal. Everyone was dirt poor, living on the edge of existence. Now you might say that hardly anyone is advocating a return to the caves. And with a few exceptions, you'd be right. But there's a lot of people nowadays who demand equality, but by this they mean we should level down rather than level up. They see the enormous gap between the developed world and the poor. They see, for example, that car ownership is much more widespread in the rich countries. However, the conclusion they draw is that we in the West should have fewer cars, not that those in the poor countries should have more. You also see this caveman logic a lot in discussions of China. Many people say China has become a lot more unequal since it started its rapid growth 30 years ago. This is true, but I would argue that despite this, we should welcome China's economic growth. The average Chinese is far better off than 3 decades ago. Economic growth has proved phenomenally successful in eradicating the most extreme forms of poverty. So even the poorest Chinese are far more prosperous as a result of 3 decades of economic growth. They might not have gained as much as their richer compatriots, but they still have a better life thanks to rising prosperity. And what applies to China applies to the rest of the world too. Where there's growth, the mass of the population tends to benefit. Some gain more than others, but most people are winners when it comes to growth. Even Africa has substantially benefited from economic growth in recent years. Take Ghana as an example. Between 1990 and 2006, the poverty rate fell from 50% to 28.5%. Undernourishment fell from 37% to 11% over the same period. The people with mobile phones rose from only 0.6% of the population in 2000 to almost a quarter in 2006. I could give a lot more indicators and examples and talk about other countries as well. I could also give a lot of examples of how shrinking economies have caused complete devastation. You can see that in Africa in the 1980s, for example. But even in cases where an elite grabs most of the proceeds of growth, the response is simple. We should be demanding more for everyone. We shouldn't let inequality become an excuse for attacking economic growth. Let those who advocate caveman equality go and live in caves. The rest of us should be fighting for more prosperity for all.
Thanks, Daniel. That was very interesting. I found it most interesting to hear you talk about elites grabbing most of the profits and growth not being an excuse to prevent growth. Do you not think that's a little defeatist, and that or do you think that income inequalities can be solved?
I think it's the opposite of defeatism. I think what often happens is that there's a populist attack against the rich. People say, oh, look at these rich people, they have so much wealth. But then that is used as a way of attacking affluence itself. And the irony, the key thing to understand, is that it's the poor who really suffer as a result of attacks on affluence. I mean, the rich have got wealth, so they're not too worried about it. It's the poor people who most of all need more affluence and more growth.
A lot of people would have suggested that the current increase in energy and food costs that is being experienced throughout the world is down to economic growth in places like China and India. Does that not mean that economic growth can have a negative effect on the poorest people in societies around the world?
I think food and energy are a bit different. If you look at food, people just talk about China without looking at the figures. If you actually look at the statistics, China imports hardly any food. It's not really a net importer, and it exports a fair amount of food. So the idea that China is contributing to rising food prices, I don't think is the case. In fact, you can draw the opposite conclusion from China, that although they've become a lot more richer and they consume a lot more food now, particularly a lot more meat, than they did 10 or 15 years ago, they also produce a hell of a lot more. In relation to energy, I think the problem is more a lack of investment in supply. That's why energy prices have been shooting up. So it's not that there isn't enough oil in the world in an absolute sense. There's plenty of oil under the ground. But the oil companies and governments haven't been investing enough to increase the capacity, so they haven't produced enough energy, which is why energy prices have shot up. But that's an argument for more investment, more growth, and increasing supply, not for holding back.
But if a lot of people suggest that if growth increases, then so will demand on oil, which, although there's a lot of it in the ground, as you say, is viewed by many as a finite resource. Is absolute equality in terms of living standards across the world even possible, would you say?
Well, I think there's slightly different questions, the kind of finite energy question and the inequality question. I think it's true living standards are increasing, and that is increasing demand for energy, particularly in the developing world. In fact, it's more flat in the developed world. But there's no shortage of oil in the ground. There's still huge amounts of oil and alternative forms of energy people can use, like nuclear power and natural gas. That is primarily a question of investment. Investing the money to build new oil wells, new refineries, to have technology so you can use that those resources more efficiently. As far as equality is concerned, it's not a question of everyone being perfectly equal. It's a question of making everyone better off so that everyone can benefit from what society has to offer in terms of technology and living standards. Everyone can enjoy a good standard of living.
So would you say that the fact that a lot of people think that consumption has a massive environmental cost and should be limited, do you think that has a negative impact on development in the third world at the moment? Or will that take place regardless of what we think in the West?
It's negative that they think that, because it means they keep on complaining. So, China's a very good example. That what's happened in China, if you look at it in an objective economic sense and social human sense, is phenomenally positive. People have become a lot better off. Absolute poverty is reduced phenomenally in China as a result of economic growth. But rather than saying, oh, that's fantastic, people are getting better off, perhaps they could get better off still, but what's happened so far has been very good. It's just become a source of concern. People saying, oh my God, the Chinese have got all these cars and mobile phones and they're so rich. And that's become a source of anxiety and concern rather than a cause for celebration. And I think that's a problem.
Thanks, Daniel. That's been really interesting. Back to you in the studio, Ruji.
Thank you, Daniel. You can read more of Daniel's work on his blog at www.danielbenami.com, which is appropriately titled Ferraris For All.